Okay, let's give it 1 second for recording to start. Okay, so just keep in mind, once again, disclaimer, this call is being recorded and we place our recording on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be recorded, you may want to drop off now. Okay, so um, today we are going to be, topic of discussion is going to be workload identity federation. Here is a, 1 second. Here is a quick agenda. So just like we always do, we are going to do a quick level set on what are workload identities, and then we're going to talk about workload identity federation, what's there. It's currently in public preview, okay, as a part of Microsoft Identity Platform. And look at some use cases and see a quick demo, and of course, Q&A. And folks, if you don't mind, if you are asking question, um, if somebody can read those from chat, I will really appreciate that person will have my gratitude. So uh, thank you in advance. Okay, so first of all, what are identities? I mean, identities are everywhere. This is a big deal these days, identity management. And there are two types of identity. Human identities, where it's a person, it's an employee, works for a company, it has its own identity. They may be partners, customers, vendors. So these are what they call human identities. Um, we are going to be talking about workload identities, and workload identities can be divided, or machine identities can be divided into two. Workload, which is related to a piece of software that is running. It can be a service or a um, virtual machine, container, or like an app service, things like that. Or you can have devices, which are um, IoT devices. They can be, sensors or desktop computers. So these are kind of different identities. But in regards to machine identities, we are going to be focusing on workload identities. Okay. So let's move forward. This is, as I said, workload identities are the identities associated with a piece of software that is running. And they can be further classified. You can have in Azure AD, you can have an application, enterprise application. You can have a service principal. That was the most popular way machine identities worked, or workload identities works, till managed identities arrived. Managed identities, think of it as lightweight service principals. And by the way, this is not the place to have an scope of this discussion is not to talk in depth about managed identities. Please just search about them and read about it if you don't know. But these are the identities which are um, either associated or uh, with a workload, or they are attached to a life cycle of the workload. For example, associated mean you can create that identity and then associate it with multiple workloads if all those workloads need access to a resource. Okay. And then you can use that identity. That is called user managed identity, or you can have system managed, which is attached to the life cycle of that service. For example, if you have an app service, um, that can have a managed identity. And with that identity, you can access, let's say, a database or a storage account or a key vault to access resources instead of hard coding some sort of access. Okay. I hope everybody is clear till this point. So why we need, when we have managed identities, service principal, all of these stuff, why we need identity, workload identity federation, why this uh, thing is here in preview. The reason is I mean, if everything is running in Azure using Azure AD, then we don't need that. But there are uh, I mean, huge amount of application which are running in other cloud, which are running on-prem, which may be using different identity providers, not Azure. Okay, for example, there may be, think of it, GitHub Actions. They use GitHub IDP. They don't use Azure AD. So let's say that GitHub Action need to access resources in Azure. Today, we have this service principal. You have the whole, you know, GitHub secret and all. I mean, this is to avoid that. This is to provide a more uh, straightforward, streamlined way of managed kind of doing identity federation. Okay, and here is how it works. I think this is we're going to spend a few minutes on this diagram just to understand how this identity federation is working. And um, uh, please feel free to ask questions. Okay. So first of all, let's say there is an external workload. I'm going to take the example of GitHub Action. This is a workload that need access to Azure resource. First of all, it needs to go in, as you can see, step one, from the external IDP, which is in this case, GitHub IDP. It's going to ask for a token. The GitHub will issue a token to it. It's going to take that token. Now we are on step three. It's going to take it to Azure AD, and it's going to ask, hey, I need for this app registration. I mean, for this app, I need to access. I need to have an access token, and that's where the heart of this whole discussion, step number 4, comes in. Okay. Now Azure AD is going to go back to the external IDP, okay, over through OIDC. And number one, checks on the trust relationship and the validate the external token. So it's going to make sure nobody is kind of trying to fool the system. So it takes it back to the system, to the external IDP. Hey, I got a token. It needs to access some of my resources. Can you validate it? Once it's validated, it will issue back an access token to the external process. Okay, in this case, external workload. In this case, as I said, GitHub Action, and then GitHub Action can go in and do its job. Basically, access Active Directory, Azure resources protected by Azure AD. Okay, any questions? Good. So as I said, the step 4 is the key here. Before, this used to be secret. You create a secret in app registration and send it to an external resource, and they used to call it to access that service principal. That's buggy because what may happen is somebody will um, kind of take your secret somehow, or they expire, or it get leaks, get into source control, and somebody may just see it. So all of these things are now avoided because you have federation between two identity providers. Okay, especially Azure AD and the external identity provider. Okay,
There's a question in the chat.
please go ahead.
Yeah, no, there's a question in the chat. It's not my question. He wants to know, it's a good question though. He wants to know which external IDPs are registered with Azure Active Directory. For instance, Okta.
Yeah, that's a good one. So right now, these are the supported scenario and preview. Actually, you're right on that slide. Number one is GitHub Actions. So GitHub is one of the IDP that you can use for GitHub Actions. That's a supported scenario. Second one is Google Cloud. So if you have workloads running in Google Cloud and they need to access Azure resources, they can do it through this IDP federation. Okay. Third one, which is the most important, and I'm going to go on a tangent for a second. As you may know, with Azure Kubernetes, which is managed Kubernetes AKS, you can have your pods now can have identity. Okay. Um, there is a new version of it out there in preview. It's called Pod Identity V2. That is using this workload identity federation. Okay. And then the last one is some of the workload. As long as you have an IDP that can use JWT token, this scenario should work. Just for the demo, we are going to be taking a look at the GitHub action just to see how this thing works end to end, and then you can apply it to other identity providers as well, like Google Cloud. I was hoping to do a Google Cloud demo, but the clock ran out on me, so uh, sorry for that. I hope that addresses your question, and thank you very much for repeating the question. I really appreciate it. Any other questions? Okie doke. So let's quickly jump into the demo. So first of all, let me show you. I have this is my GitHub repo. It's a public repo. I have nothing much in it, just some README and a GitHub action workflow. And I want from this workflow, GitHub actions, I need to access my Azure services. Okay. And for that, I'm going to be using this workload identity federation. So that's the goal. So here are the steps that I have to do. And by the way, folks, these steps are very well outlined in the documentation, but I just want to show it to you how does that work. So, just kind of, so if you miss something, the documentation is pretty decent in this case. Okay. So first, what I'm going to do is I need to register an application. Okay, so what I will do is, okay, and just you can give it anything. And we are going to use, it's going to web application. Yes, it has to be HTTPS. So with that, register. It will take a few seconds. And uh, as always, you have to note down this application ID and, of course, the tenant ID and subscription ID. That goes without saying. Um, but first of all, but this is the screen that has been updated. I'm pretty sure everybody knows certificates. You have client secrets, all the usual stuff. But this is something new, federated credentials. This is what has been introduced as a part of this particular preview. And what this is, that's where you set up the federation. This is where you're going to be setting up the federation. So for example, each step is different for different one. For Google, you will use this one. You will create a Google application and follow the steps. For GitHub, basically, you don't have to do anything here. I mean, if you really want to change it, you have some custom, different GitHub setup. You can change it, but that's the default. You will have to provide your organization name. In this case, it's going to be Naveed's here. This is the name of your repo, and this is the entity type. What would be the entity type that you? And in that case, I'm just going to use the branch name. It will be main. Okay. So you will set up all these things. The next is what are the credential name. So as you can see, pretty much all the stuff is, there is no rocket science there. All the stuff is pretty standard. The GitHub repo name, I can copy it. Not good with typing, so I'm just going to copy this GitHub repo name from here and paste it. I hope everybody with me so far. Okay. So once you set it up, okay, you just say add. Okay, you have to give it a name here. So we can the name here as well and just add it. And this will add this credential in here. Okay. I already have set it up a um, credential. So I just want to show it to you that this is the credential that I have set up. As you can see, all of this. So this is that part. Now you will take, as I said, the application ID of this, and now you will go to the side of GitHub. Okay, go to your application, go to your repository, and go to settings, and go into secrets, actions, and the client ID is what we have here. This is your application ID, your client ID. This is that. Copy that from, and then you do it over there. The second part is the subscription ID. You know what your subscription ID is. And tenant ID, this is the Azure AD. So whatever Azure AD tenant that you're using, in this case, I have my own development tenant. I'm going to be using that ID. This is this. If I'm here, this is the actual Azure Active Directory tenant ID. Okay, that's all there is to it. You paste all of these here and set these secrets up. Okay, and by the way, you can give any name, but just keep in mind you're going to be using these secrets when you are going to be creating a token. So just want to confirm, everybody okay with this setup, setting up on both sides? Okay, any questions?
So this would allow you to provision Azure resources, but for accessing the Azure Container Registry and pushing stuff, will this
Yes.
suffice, or you need to?
There is one step. There is one step. So that's the federation. Now, what you need to do is you have this service principal created. You need to give it appropriate permission. Think of it. This is gonna be working on the behalf of GitHub action. So you have to give it appropriate permission. So for example, you have a storage account, for example, you have a virtual machine here, okay? And you want this to manage a virtual machine. What you will do is you will go to that virtual machine, you go to identity and access management, go to role assignments, and you say, okay, I want to add role assignment, and let's say you pick up contributor, okay? And the next thing, what you're going to do here is you are going to pick up um, that particular service principal, okay? So you give it appropriate permission. Remember, doing federation is one piece. You have to give it appropriate permissions as well, okay? And then it will, so as you said, let's say you want it to access ACR, some image from ACR. You want it to access something from Key Vault. You have to give appropriate access there, okay? So what I have done is for this demo service principal, I have given this one a contributor access to my subscription. Since it's a demo and I'm being generous, I am just give it a contributor access. So if I look at the um, access control and role assignments, if I go down here, you will see um, a contributor. Where is, yeah. So you will see this policy here. You see GitHub, this is the contributor, GitHub workload demo. Okay, this is the same thing that I have here. Okay, so that's once that connection is set up. Now let's quickly go back to our okay, first of all, does that answer your question? So I have a GitHub action set up. Let's take a look at that workflow. Okay. So what I'm going to do is let's look at the workflow file. And this is my workflow file, run Azure login with OpenID Connect. And this is pretty standard stuff. And what I'm doing is I'm running on Ubuntu. And this is my activity name, AZCLI. And I am passing these things with it, client ID, secret, all of that stuff. Okay. And what it will do is it's going to send, it's first of all, GitHub action. Just remember the steps on the presentation screen. First, GitHub action is going to get authenticated with GitHub, get an a token, then it's going to take that token with the information that we have provided here to Azure AD, and Azure AD is going to see that and it's going to see, okay, it is asking permission for that particular workload, for that particular service principal. So it's going to issue a token back and then allow it to go through. And then that's it's going to GitHub action is going to be using that service principal to access everything. Any questions?
So for ACR, right? I noticed that I have to embed, for pushing and pulling images, I have to embed the ACR username and password as secrets in the GitHub settings. I'm not sure whether that is still enabled with the federation. It's because it's not
I have to
RBAC.
check. I have to check
Okay.
that. Hopefully that, I mean, that should be enabled with the federation. Um, I mean, but just keep in mind this is in preview, so I haven't tested that scenario. I mean, I'm testing the scenario that I'm showing here is very basic in a sense that it's gonna run the CLI and then it's gonna run these commands. Azure account, show group list. So just to demonstrate that it has access to that particular resources. But yeah, I think that's a good point. We can test it out. I haven't tested that ACR. So yeah, that's something to be seen. Okay. So this is the workflow. This is the information. So once it gets to the Azure AD, it passes that information. Azure AD goes back to GitHub, make sure that it's a valid credential, token is valid, and it validates the federation based on this information, and then it issues the token back to this process, to this GitHub action, and then GitHub action through that service principal can do its job. Okay, so that's the end-to-end scenario. So what we can do is let's rerun it. Let's see how it works just to see the output. So once again, we go back to actions, and this is the action that's running, build and deploy. It's starting. So um, it's setting up the job, and it's going to run in a second. So give it a second. It's now going to be running CLI commands. So as you can see, there's a lot of CLI stuff. But basically all the commands it's able to successfully run. It's able to query the resources from resource group, from the Azure subscription and all that. How? Because of all of this federated identity setup. So just keep in mind now Azure AD can go and it can talk to Azure AD, present a token, Azure AD. This is the step that is making it happen. As I said before, step number 4, where Azure AD goes to the external IDP and through the OpenID Connect Issuer URL and ask, hey, I got this token. Can you validate it? And then it validates the token, and then it issues the token that to the external resources so it can access resources protected by Azure AD. Okay. So any question in the chat window? Let me see if I can access it.
Sorry, Naveed, I want to ask to Greece, for ACR push and pull, will this federated identity approach will work, or will ACR still has to be explicit ACR username as password on top of the secret ID,
Yeah, that's a
So
good
what
question. As I said, I haven't tried it. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry. What I found is for entities like ACR, right, which have their own access and gating mechanisms, like, to push and pull images from ACR, you need to use the user ID and password. I didn't find a way around it. But if you are doing the Azure stuff, right, like deploying stuff into Azure where you have Azure, where you need Azure roles and permissions, right, the federated identity would work. I mean, that's what I know up to this point. It can change.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, exactly. We have to test it out. I mean, I think federated identity should work, ideally, but we have to see. I mean, I haven't tested that scenario, so I won't say for sure, because that's exactly the cases where which it is trying to address, where you have to use these because previously, if you remember, we had, I mean, if we go here, we used to have client secret. So you have to take that secret, use it. Somebody by accident expose the secret through source code, and everybody is like now trying to expire that, delete it. But then you found out that 10,000 different applications were using it and they are no longer working. So that's all causes a lot of commotion, and that is to stop that. For that particular scenario, that ACR, we'll have to test it out. So probably we will do one more session definitely to cover the AKS piece. And because that's very interesting with the whole pod identities v2 and going with that. But that's that. So any other questions?
I have one more question.
Mhm.
So as you were mentioning about the client secret, so that in application, let's say I just have a plain functions and function needs to access or do something, then the concept was that we are using these client secrets, right? So the app registration and client secret, like this service principal. The federated credentials is helping the way I see is in a lot of GitHub deployments, which means they don't need to be exposed. They don't need to be kept in application layer. They can be just kept as secrets in GitHub and then configured here. Then nothing is being exposed. We'll still need to think as to how my application can use some of those credentials. I don't have an example at the moment, but as we are talking about ACR pull and scenario, maybe we have to test it out for other scenarios where maybe now we can do things a little differently and not to have that concern where applications can expose certain these client secrets.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. So just to be clear, if you are using Azure Function, you need to access some. You should be using managed identity. There is no reason not to use managed identity for Azure applications. If it is available, you should be using it. This is typical for scenario where you have external resources or external workloads. Uh, like I'm just using GitHub Action or a process running in Google or a process running on-prem or somewhere, which is using an identity provider which is not Azure. Okay? So in that case, that's where this thing comes into picture where you have to set up identity federation. If there is something running in Azure, it should be using managed identity. If it is not, I mean, there has to be a really strong reason why it cannot, either it's
Sure.
not available or something like that.
It makes sense. Thanks for the clarification. Yep, makes sense.
Any other questions, folks? Okay. Since there are no questions, we are right on time. My God, man, we are kind of did the right on time thing today. So I hope to see everybody next week. I hope everybody stay safe and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much for joining, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.